The story begins in an age where belief governs every horizon and survival depends on allegiance to forces both earthly and divine. Europe at the turn of the 12th century is a place of rigid hierarchies and restless movement, where kings rule by fragile claims, the church speaks with unquestioned authority, and the ordinary soul lives beneath the constant shadow of judgment. Roads are dangerous, borders uncertain, and the promise of salvation draws men across continents toward lands they have never seen. Jerusalem exists not merely as a city, but as an idea powerful enough to uproot lives, drain treasuries, and ignite wars carried by faith rather than reason. In this world, violence is not an exception but a condition. Pilgrims traveling eastward walk paths haunted by bandits, hunger, and disease, trusting that devotion alone might shield them. The Crusades have opened wounds that never fully close, and even victory carries the taste of instability. Newly conquered territories demand protection, order, and symbols of legitimacy, yet the rulers who claim them are stretched thin. It is within this fragile space, where sacred purpose collides with brutal necessity, that something unusual begins to form. A small group of knights steps forward, not as conquerors, but as guardians. They swear themselves to a life that contradicts the world they inhabit, renouncing wealth while standing amid riches, pledging humility while wielding arms. Their vows bind them to silence as much as to service, and their loyalty is pledged not to a crown, but to an idea shaped by faith and discipline. At first, they attract little attention. History often overlooks what does not announce itself loudly, and power in its earliest form rarely demands recognition. Yet the conditions of the age begin to shape them. Protection requires organization requires trust, and trust requires rules known only to those within. The rhythms of prayer merge with the routines of warfare, producing a brotherhood unlike any other in medieval society. These men exist between worlds, neither fully monks nor fully soldiers, operating in spaces where authority overlaps and accountability fades. Their isolation becomes their strength, and their discipline, forged by danger, becomes a quiet source of influence. As years pass, recognition follows necessity. Rulers seek reliability in an unreliable age, and the church seeks instruments capable of enforcing its will without fracturing its image. Privileges are granted, exemptions declared, and the brotherhood's reach extends beyond the roads they guard. Wealth flows toward them not through conquest alone, but through trust, donations, and promises of spiritual favor. In an era where security is rare, those who can guarantee it gain more than gratitude. They gain leverage. The world begins to change around them, though few notice how deeply. Systems emerge that move resources across borders without armies, messages travel faster through loyalty than through law, and a network quietly takes shape beneath the visible structures of medieval power. Nothing about this transformation is sudden. It unfolds through habit, repetition, and necessity, hidden beneath the language of devotion. Secrecy does not arise from ambition alone, but from survival in a world where knowledge can be as dangerous as a sword. Suspicion, however, is never far behind reverence. The same silence that protects also invites fear, and the same unity that inspires confidence provokes envy. Whispers begin to circulate, indistinct at first, then sharpened by rivalry and debt. In a society where truth is often decided by authority rather than evidence, rumors gain weight simply by being repeated. What is not understood becomes threatening, and what is powerful without explanation becomes intolerable. This first chapter closes within that tension, long before accusations are spoken aloud or judgments rendered. The age itself seems to hold its breath, balanced between devotion and doubt. The Brotherhood continues its work, unaware that its greatest trial will not come from the battlefield or the wilderness, but from the shifting nature of power itself. History moves quietly here, laying foundations that will one day support both legend and ruin, while the world watches without yet realizing what has begun. Time alters loyalties more surely than war. As the decades advance, the fragile equilibrium that once defined the eastern territories begins to strain under its own weight. Kingdoms born of crusades struggle to sustain themselves, surrounded by rivals who learn quickly and adapt relentlessly. What was once defended by zeal now demands structure, supply, and endurance. In this environment, reliability becomes more valuable than courage, and those who can provide it begin to matter far beyond their original purpose. The Brotherhood's presence expands quietly, almost imperceptibly. Their houses multiply along the roads of pilgrimage and within the fortified cities of the Levant, but their influence grows even faster in places far removed from conflict. In Europe, lands are granted, revenues assigned, and privileges confirmed with solemn seals. Kings entrust them with treasure, nobles with estates, and families with the hope that association might secure both earthly protection and eternal favor. The flow of wealth is steady, not dramatic, accumulating through habit rather than conquest, until the scale of it becomes difficult to comprehend. This accumulation demands order. Ledgers replace swords as instruments of power, and discipline proves as effective in counting rooms as it does in battle. The Brotherhood develops systems that allow value to move without physically traveling, promises to stand in for gold, and trust to replace force. In a fragmented world, this quiet innovation binds distant regions together more efficiently than armies ever could. Yet it also places the order beyond the easy reach of any single ruler, answering instead to a spiritual authority that itself balances on political ground. Such independence unsettles the medieval mind. Power, to be tolerated, must be visible and accountable, yet this brotherhood answers questions only within its own walls. Its members are known by their symbols, but their decisions remain internal, shielded by ritual and rule. The Church praises their devotion while monitoring their autonomy. Monarchs depend on their services while resenting their immunity. Each alliance carries within it the seed of conflict, nourished by ambition and suspicion in equal measure. Beyond the halls of authority, the ordinary world feels the effects without understanding their source. Markets stabilize, routes grow safer, and the movement of people becomes less chaotic. These changes appear gradual, almost natural, yet they are sustained by networks invisible to those who benefit from them. The Brotherhood's strength lies not in spectacle, but in consistency, a quality rare enough to inspire both gratitude and fear. Where others fail unpredictably, they endure. At the same time, the struggle for the Holy Land intensifies. Victories fade, losses accumulate, and the sense of divine favor becomes uncertain. Faith does not vanish, but it hardens, forced to confront limits it was never meant to acknowledge. As territories shrink and alliances falter, questions emerge about purpose and relevance. The Brotherhood adapts outwardly, but inwardly, the strain of maintaining an identity tied to a failing cause begins to show. Survival now depends less on the battlefield and more on negotiation, perception, and restraint. Rumors gather strength in this climate. Tales of secret rites, hidden wealth, and forbidden knowledge circulate among those excluded from the inner circle. Some are born of ignorance, others of rivalry, but all feed a growing unease. In a society where authority rests on visible hierarchy, the idea of power operating quietly and efficiently becomes deeply unsettling. Silence, once a virtue, is reinterpreted as concealment. As the chapter draws toward its close, the Brotherhood stands at the height of its material strength and the edge of its greatest vulnerability. It has become indispensable to the very powers that resent its independence, admired by those who fear it, and protected by institutions that may one day abandon it. History tightens its grip here, not through open confrontation, but through the slow convergence of dependency, envy, and doubt. The world has changed around the order, and in that change, the conditions for its undoing are already taking shape, though no single voice yet dares to name them aloud. The turning point does not arrive with a trumpet or a proclamation, but with exhaustion. The long struggle for the Eastern kingdoms reaches its inevitable conclusion as strongholds fall one by one and the last illusions of permanence dissolve. What had once been justified as a sacred mission now appears increasingly untenable, sustained more by memory than by strategy. When the final bastions are lost, the shock is not only military but psychological. The world that required the Brotherhood's original purpose no longer exists, and with its disappearance comes a dangerous question: what role remains for those shaped by its demands? The withdrawal westward exposes the order to a different kind of scrutiny. Removed from the urgency of frontier warfare, its wealth and privileges stand in sharper contrast to the poverty of the societies that surround it. What was once tolerated as necessary begins to appear excessive. Rulers burdened by debt look closely at accounts once ignored, and churchmen uneasy with autonomy begin to reconsider exemptions granted in more desperate times. The Brotherhood's strength, built through adaptation, now becomes a liability, making it visible in ways it was never meant to be. Political circumstances sharpen this tension further. Monarchies consolidate, seeking control over institutions that operate beyond their reach. Authority, once dispersed and negotiable, begins to centralize, demanding obedience rather than cooperation. In this new environment, loyalty to a transnational order appears suspect, even dangerous. The Brotherhood's refusal to bend to local command is no longer viewed as principled discipline, but as defiance. The accusations that follow grow from this soil. They are not spontaneous, nor entirely fabricated, but shaped to serve immediate needs. Charges of heresy, corruption, and moral transgression surface, carefully constructed to undermine legitimacy rather than uncover truth. Confessions are obtained under conditions where survival itself depends on compliance, and silence is recast as proof of guilt. The legal process, draped in the language of faith, becomes a tool of erasure. The consequences unfold with chilling efficiency. Arrests ripple outward, property is seized, and reputations are dismantled in public view. Allies distance themselves, calculating the cost of loyalty against the danger of association. The Church, caught between principle and pressure, hesitates just long enough for momentum to decide the outcome. What remains is a spectacle of justice that satisfies power while leaving questions unanswered. Yet cause and effect do not end with destruction. As the order collapses, gaps appear in the structures it once maintained. Financial systems fracture, trust networks dissolve, and functions once performed quietly must be reassigned or reinvented. The very efficiency that made the brotherhood indispensable now reveals how deeply it had been embedded in the fabric of society. Its absence is felt not as relief, but as instability. The fate of its members diverges. Some disappear into obscurity, others are absorbed into new roles, carrying with them habits of discipline and secrecy learned over decades. Knowledge does not vanish simply because an institution falls, it migrates, reshaping itself to fit new contexts. The dissolution, intended as an ending, becomes instead a transformation. As this chapter closes, the order's public identity has been extinguished, but its legacy remains unresolved. The collapse demonstrates how power, once tolerated, can become intolerable when circumstances change, and how institutions built for one era can become threats in another. History marks this moment as an ending, yet beneath the surface, continuities persist, waiting for conditions that will allow them to re-emerge under different names and symbols. The disappearance of a powerful order does not bring clarity, it creates a vacuum. In the years that follow its destruction, Europe enters a period of uneasy recalibration. Authority attempts to reassert itself, yet the tools once relied upon are fractured. Wealth that had moved predictably now stagnates or is violently redistributed. Trust, once maintained through reputation and ritual, must be renegotiated through force or decree. The collapse sends ripples far beyond the men who wore the symbols, altering relationships between crowns, churches, and the populations bound beneath them. Power, having demonstrated its ability to erase, grows more cautious and more aggressive at the same time. Monarchs tighten their grip, fearing any structure they cannot fully command. The Church reinforces orthodoxy, wary of deviation disguised as devotion. In this atmosphere, secrecy itself becomes suspect, and any gathering beyond official sanction invites scrutiny. Yet the need that secrecy once served has not vanished. Knowledge still carries risk, and association still offers protection in a world where stability remains fragile. As centuries turn, Europe transforms under pressures the medieval mind could scarcely imagine. Trade expands, cities swell, and a new class emerges, neither noble nor peasant, defined by skill and commerce rather than land or blood. These men require new forms of belonging and new languages of identity. The rigid hierarchies of the past strain under the weight of innovation, and ideas begin to circulate more freely, challenging inherited truths without openly defying them. Within this changing landscape, older traditions adapt quietly. Practices once tied to sacred warfare or monastic discipline find new expression among craftsmen, scholars, and thinkers. Symbols survive because they are useful, not because they are understood. Allegory replaces doctrine, and moral instruction is embedded within metaphor. What had once been enforced by vow is now sustained by choice, making commitment both more fragile and more deliberate. The tension deepens as knowledge becomes a source of power distinct from birthright. Literacy spreads unevenly, creating divisions between those who can interpret the world and those who must accept its explanations. Institutions that encourage controlled learning attract suspicion from authorities who sense, correctly, that ideas can erode obedience more effectively than violence. The memory of past suppression lingers, shaping behavior and reinforcing caution. Silence is practiced not as obedience, but as survival. Rumors of continuity surface in this period, shaped less by evidence than by fear. Stories circulate of hidden lines connecting the past to the present, of knowledge preserved and transmitted beyond the reach of kings. Whether true or exaggerated, these narratives gain strength because they speak to anxiety. The destruction of one order has not eliminated the possibility of another, and the thought unsettles those who equate control with security. As political borders harden and states grow more ambitious, the stakes increase. Wars are no longer fought solely for land or faith, but for influence and legitimacy. Alliances shift rapidly, and loyalty becomes transactional. In such a climate, discrete networks capable of operating across boundaries become both valuable and dangerous. The lesson of the past is remembered selectively. Power fears what it cannot monitor, yet repeatedly turns to it when conventional means fail. The chapter closes in an age poised between inheritance and invention. The old world has not vanished, but it no longer governs unchallenged. Structures of authority stand taller than ever, yet beneath them move currents that resist confinement. History here tightens its focus, preparing the ground for new forms of association that will inherit both the caution and the ambition born from centuries of suppression. The tension remains unresolved, not because events have stalled, but because the next transformation is already underway, gathering strength beyond the reach of open record. The age that follows is defined by upheaval that no authority fully controls. Wars expand in scale and consequence, pulling entire populations into conflicts once confined to armies alone. Old certainties fracture as gunpowder reshapes the battlefield and printing reshapes the mind. Ideas travel faster than decrees, and belief, once anchored in tradition, becomes increasingly subject to examination. Discovery ceases to be accidental and becomes deliberate, pursued with method and confidence. The world grows larger, more complex, and far less obedient. In this climate, the structures that survive by adaptation now find both opportunity and danger. Quiet associations devoted to moral instruction and shared symbolism spread through cities alive with debate and ambition. They do not announce revolutions, yet they attract those who sense that the existing order is insufficient. Within carefully regulated spaces, men speak of reason, virtue, and improvement, not as challenges to authority, but as refinements of it. The language is measured, the rituals restrained, but the implications are profound. As kingdoms exhaust themselves through war, the cost of absolutism becomes visible. Taxation strains loyalty, and privilege hardens into resentment. In salons, workshops, and lodges, conversations continue that cannot yet be spoken openly. They draw from ancient allegory and contemporary thought alike, blending continuity with innovation. No single meeting changes history, yet collectively they nurture a shift in how power is understood, from something inherited to something justified. The tension reaches a peak as revolutions erupt. In some lands, they are sudden and violent, fueled by hunger and anger long suppressed. In others, they unfold through reform and compromise, reshaping institutions without destroying them. In every case, the role of discrete networks is debated endlessly afterward. Some credit them with guiding transformation, others accuse them of manipulation. The truth remains elusive, obscured by fear, pride, and the desire to assign blame for events too vast to belong to any single hand. Empires respond as they always have, with force and surveillance. Associations are banned, infiltrated, or co-opted. Symbols are scrutinized, oaths questioned, and loyalty tested. Yet repression proves uneven, and prohibition often amplifies curiosity. What is forbidden acquires significance beyond its actual power. The myth grows alongside the reality, each feeding the other until distinction becomes difficult. Amid these storms, scientific discovery accelerates. The natural world is measured, categorized, and explained with increasing confidence. This pursuit of knowledge alters humanity's relationship with mystery itself. Where faith once filled gaps in understanding, reason now competes for authority. Yet the desire for meaning does not disappear. It seeks new forms, blending empirical inquiry with moral reflection, progress with restraint. As the chapter draws to a close, the modern world stands partially formed, shaped by conflict and conviction in equal measure. Thrones have fallen, nations have been born, and ideas once whispered now circulate openly. Still, beneath the surface of public history, quieter traditions persist, neither directing events nor detached from them. They endure by remaining adaptable, absorbing the lessons of collapse and revolution alike. The peak moments of this era do not resolve the tension between secrecy and power, they intensify it, ensuring that the question of hidden influence will survive into the centuries that follow. The aftermath arrives not with celebration, but with weariness. The great convulsions of war and revolution leave societies altered in ways that are not immediately understood. Victories feel incomplete, defeats unresolved. New governments inherit old anxieties, and promises made in moments of fervor prove difficult to keep once order must be maintained. Streets grow quieter, but the silence carries questions rather than peace. The world pauses, uncertain of what it has become. Institutions turn inward, attempting to stabilize themselves after years of strain. Laws are rewritten, borders redrawn, and symbols replaced, yet beneath these visible changes, habits of thought persist. Power learns to speak the language of legitimacy rather than divine right, but it remains wary of forces it cannot fully trace. Surveillance becomes more subtle, control more procedural. Authority adapts, not by erasing dissent, but by managing it. Those quiet associations that survived upheaval now find themselves in an altered position. They are no longer merely suspect, they are increasingly misunderstood. Some distance themselves from public life, choosing discretion over relevance. Others attempt engagement, aligning with charitable work, education, and moral reform. The rituals endure, but their meanings soften, reshaped by a world less tolerant of absolutes. What once felt dangerous now appears antiquated to some, yet to others it remains unsettling precisely because it persists. Memory becomes a battlefield in this period. The past is interpreted selectively, molded to justify present arrangements. Narratives of hidden control flourish alongside dismissals of irrational fear. Each generation inherits fragments of truth and layers them with speculation. The absence of definitive answers allows imagination to thrive, and secrecy, whether real or assumed, fills the gaps left by incomplete records. Silence continues to speak, though fewer agree on what it says. Social life shifts as industrial rhythms replace older patterns of belonging. Work becomes specialized, communities more fragmented. In this environment, the appeal of structured fellowship grows stronger, offering continuity in a world defined by change. Yet such belonging now competes with mass movements and ideologies that promise identity on a far larger scale. The individual stands between intimacy and abstraction, searching for meaning without surrendering autonomy. Religion, too, adjusts its posture. Once dominant, now challenged by science and pluralism, it seeks relevance through adaptation rather than command. Moral authority fragments, spreading across institutions rather than resting in one. This diffusion creates space for ethical discussion outside traditional frameworks, but it also leaves uncertainty about who speaks with legitimacy. The old fear of heresy gives way to a new fear of meaninglessness. As decades pass, the urgency of past struggles fades into commemoration. Monuments replace barricades, anniversaries replace alarm. Yet the structures built in response to crisis remain, shaping behavior long after their origins are forgotten. Laws born of fear persist in times of calm, and networks formed for survival continue out of habit. History does not reset, it accumulates. The chapter closes in a quieter register, attentive to continuity rather than climax. The world moves forward, but it does so carrying unresolved tensions between openness and restraint, reason and ritual, memory and myth. What follows the great events is not clarity, but accommodation. Humanity learns to live with ambiguity, and in doing so, preserves the conditions that allow old questions to endure, waiting for moments when uncertainty once again demands explanation. Time stretches the distance between cause and consequence until they appear unrelated. Generations pass who know the great upheavals only as inherited memory, compressed into lessons taught rather than experiences lived. Yet history persists not only in archives and monuments, but in habits quietly transmitted from one life to another. The long-term legacy of secrecy, discipline, and selective trust settles into society not as doctrine, but as instinct. In small, unremarkable lives, the echoes remain. A craftsman teaches his apprentice not only technique, but restraint. A scholar learns when to publish and when to remain silent. A soldier returning from war carries forward a loyalty shaped less by flag than by shared ordeal. These individuals do not imagine themselves as part of any grand design, yet their choices reflect traditions older than they realize. Large-scale history advances through treaties and revolutions, but it is sustained through repetition in ordinary moments. The associations that once stood near the center of controversy now exist mostly at the margins of attention. Their influence is neither dramatic nor decisive, but persistent. Charitable acts, educational efforts, and ethical debates provide a public face that contrasts sharply with darker legends. This contrast itself becomes part of their legacy, illustrating how institutions can outlive their original purpose by transforming it. Continuity is achieved not through rigidity, but through reinterpretation. States, meanwhile, grow more complex and more powerful. Bureaucracy replaces charisma, and systems replace individuals. Authority no longer depends on mystery, yet it still relies on trust, something no law can fully command. Governments remember the dangers of unregulated networks even as they quietly reproduce similar structures within intelligence services, financial systems, and diplomatic channels. What was once feared as clandestine becomes normalized when absorbed into the machinery of the state. Public fascination with hidden influence does not fade, it evolves. Stories circulate more widely now, shaped by media rather than rumor. Some seek reassurance that history is guided by unseen order, others search for culprits to explain injustice and uncertainty. Both impulses reveal a discomfort with randomness. The legacy of secret societies becomes inseparable from this psychological need, making them symbols as much as institutions. Personal testimonies, when they surface, are often understated. Members speak less of power than of belonging, less of control than of continuity. Their accounts resist both glorification and condemnation, offering instead a record of human longing for structure and meaning. These voices rarely dominate historical narratives, yet they complicate them, reminding us that participation is often motivated by identity rather than ambition. As centuries accumulate, the sharp edges of conflict dull into ambiguity. What once inspired fear becomes curiosity, and what once demanded suppression becomes heritage. Museums display symbols stripped of urgency, while scholars debate significance without urgency. Still, the underlying tension remains unresolved, because it is rooted not in any single organization, but but in the relationship between knowledge and authority. The chapter closes by drawing these strands together, not into a verdict, but into a pattern. The long-term consequences of secretive traditions are neither wholly corrosive nor wholly constructive. They reveal how humans navigate power when transparency feels insufficient and control feels overwhelming. Through personal stories woven into the larger fabric of history, the legacy endures as a quiet reminder that the forces shaping civilizations are often sustained not by spectacle, but by belief carried patiently from one generation to the next. The final reckoning of this story does not arrive as a revelation, but as a recognition. When the long arc of centuries is traced carefully, what emerges is not a hidden hand directing events, nor a simple tale of innocence misunderstood, but a recurring human response to uncertainty. Across ages marked by faith, war, reason, and industry, the same pressures return in altered form: fear of chaos, desire for order, and the need to belong to something that feels enduring when the world does not. The warrior monks of the medieval roads, the craftsmen of the lodges, the thinkers of the early modern cities, and the citizens navigating revolutions are separated by time, yet connected by circumstance. Each generation confronts moments when existing structures prove insufficient, when authority feels distant or arbitrary, and when meaning must be reinforced through shared symbols and controlled knowledge. Secrecy, in this context, is not merely concealment, but a boundary, a way of defining who is inside and who is not. History shows how easily such boundaries provoke fear. Power distrusts what it cannot fully see, while societies burdened by crisis search for explanations that simplify complexity. In these moments, secretive groups become screens onto which anxieties are projected. Sometimes they are blamed for forces they did not create, other times they are romanticized as guardians of wisdom they do not claim to possess. The truth, when it can be approached at all, lies somewhere between these extremes. What endures most clearly is not influence, but adaptability. Institutions that survive do so by shedding certainty and embracing ambiguity, by allowing symbols to outlive their original meanings, and by permitting individuals to reinterpret tradition rather than enforce it. Those that fail are often the ones that mistake permanence for invulnerability. The destruction of one order and the persistence of others illustrate the same lesson from opposite directions. History tolerates continuity only when it can evolve. The modern world, with its unprecedented access to information, has not resolved the tension between openness and control. Instead, it has transformed it. Networks are no longer hidden by ritual alone, but by scale and complexity. Power operates through systems few fully understand, and trust is extended daily to institutions that function far beyond individual oversight. In this sense, the age of secrecy has not ended, it has been normalized. As the documentary draws to its close, the figures who once seemed central recede into context. The Knights Templar become less a mystery than a moment, the Freemasons less a conspiracy than a reflection. What matters is not what these societies knew or hid, but what their existence reveals about the societies that produced them. They are records of human attempts to impose coherence on disorder, to preserve values amid transformation, and to negotiate the fragile balance between independence and authority. The story ends where it began, not with answers, but with conditions. As long as fear and hope coexist, as long as power remains imperfect and knowledge unevenly distributed, the impulse to gather quietly, to speak selectively, and to belong deliberately will persist. History does not close this chapter, it carries it forward, reshaped by time, waiting to be recognized again in forms yet to emerge.